Okay. Welcome. My name is Jay Frost, and if you've been to this party before, you know that this is the Philanthropy Mastermind series brought to you by DonorSearch. And as usual, you won't hear much about the company. We are just grateful they are providing a platform to have conversations like the great one we're about to have. And that's all courtesy of their commitment to this sector, the nonprofit world, this world of generosity, which we're going to be talking about at length for the next few minutes. And once again, my name is Jay Frost. I'm the host of this series, but I'd like you to go and take a look at the rest of the series after we're done today. You can find out all about it at DonorSearch.net under the resources tab, where recordings of this session and many others are all there for you to share with colleagues who can't be with you live. And you can also see them on YouTube. There's a direct link. There's a schedule for future programs as well. So please check out these programs and let other people know about them. And while you're there, check out what DonorSearch has to offer, will you? They're all about the donors, and so are you. And so if we're really going to pay attention to what their needs and interests are, one place to start is, of course, to know more about them. That's what DonorSearch is all about, again, at DonorSearch.net. But with that, I want to jump into this subject about generosity. And what better prop than that? And more importantly, the two authors right here live from New York. It's Monday afternoon, and but I am with Brian Crimmins, a CEO of Changing Our World. If you're not familiar with the company, shame on you, but look them up afterwards today. They're obviously one of the prime movers in the not-for-profit space, but also part of a collection of companies that is a major force in the world of corporate communications and many other things. So Changing Our World is a friend you want to make, and Brian is a terrific spokesperson, not just for that company, but for our sector. And of course, a friend who's been in this series before, Nathan Chappell, who is Senior Vice President or Executive Vice President. I never remember what his title is. Senior Vice President. I don't want to give him a demotion accidentally at DonorSearch AI, which of course is the artificial intelligence division of DonorSearch, but maybe more importantly, a prime mover in utilizing artificial intelligence and machine learning to really understand where our donors are coming from now, but maybe more importantly, where they're going to come from in the future as we address the subject of this book, which is the generosity crisis. So where do I start? Can you tell us, Brian, the genesis of this book? How did this come about?
Yeah, sure, Jay. Thanks for having me on. The genesis of the book was really Nathan and I met years ago when we were working on a project together. He was kind enough to bring our firm in to start doing some consulting work. And as we joked before, we sort of love at first sight. We sort of saw the world very similarly. When you start having meetings with a client, and then those meetings either go longer or the conversations continue after the work hours on the phone, at a restaurant, over a meal. That really was what was the foundational element of our friendship, and still is beyond that today. And it was definitely over a few years, months and years, where we would talk about, whether we called it the generosity crisis or not, we were talking about what was happening to our sector and to our industry, and jokingly wondering who was going to write the book. Most recently, about 2 years ago, before COVID, Nathan was here in New York for an AI conference, and I think he called out the audience, basically, someone's got to write this book. And then it was about a year and a half ago, we said, you know what? Time to do it ourselves. Let's just put our heads together. We come at the world from different viewpoints, but we have a lot of shared value, shared commonality, and that really laid the foundation for what was about a 13-month effort to put the book together.
Well, so put you on the spot. What's that difference in backgrounds that led to this great recipe?
It's so interesting because actually so much of the book originated here in New York, and I live in California, and actually there's a bar down the street that probably a majority of it was flushed out in our heads, although we didn't know it. Years ago, we would be like, hey, I'm in New York, let's, grab a drink. And literally like 3 hours would go by. We were like, and we were just talking about these big societal issues. And, Brian, is a very macro thinker. Like, he looks at the world in a much more a macro holistic perspective, really, because of his experience, has a lot more experience in how corporations position themselves to connect with people, and it also has the nonprofit background. I'm definitely more on the tactical side, so I spent 20 years fundraising and fundraising operations, so definitely more like, well, that sounds great, but boots on the ground, like, I know how hard the struggle is. And now, of course, the last couple of years, my work in AI has given a whole different perspective on what are the real motivations of giving, which, again, going back to corporate, they've mastered that over the years. They've gotten really, really good at it. We borrow examples of that in the nonprofit sector, but the largest companies in the world are they use precision and personalization every day. So Brian just brings this great wealth of experience on the corporate world. I bring more boots on the ground on the nonprofit side, and I really is just together. We're like, look, we can't just only talk to nonprofits, or we can't only talk to corporations. This is not an or issue; it's an and issue.
This is there's a lot to unpack even in what you just said, because there's differences between for-profit and not-for-profit, and whether those terms even make any difference anymore, especially if what we're trying to do is figure out who's the customer, who's the contributor, who's the donor, who's the change agent. So as you two were sitting at the bar talking about this stuff, did you find that there were some real differences that you thought about these things that then as you worked through the book, you came to a common agreement?
I have to go first, because I totally disagreed with Brian for a lot. Like, he challenged me a lot in writing this book as we were doing our outlines and working through. It's been like a year and a half of I mean, my view of corporate engagement and corporate connection and role of corporations in society was a bit more negative, like in the beginning. Like, it was more like that protectiveness of the representing the nonprofit of like, because many nonprofits believe like they're taking our market share, they're taking attention away from us, and they're talking more like us. And I saw that as a negative for a while. I mean, he chipped away at me for a while. Like it took like continuing to just beat the drum. Like there's lessons to be taken, a lot of lessons to be taken. And so I don't know, there was one point probably 2/3 of the way through the book that I like the light bulb finally went on. Never said I was a fast learner, but the light bulb goes on and I'm like, dang, he's right. Like, there's a really important story, and that story's not going away. The story's getting, it's going to continue to get bigger and better over time.
Yeah, and I would say to add on to that, for a long time, one of my colleagues, Dr. Susan Raymond at Change Our World, helped develop this framework of thinking that we use with our clients, which we say from data to intelligence to strategy. And so I believed in it. I believe in it to this day. When the data to intelligence part, when I met Nathan, I had no idea what was possible when he started talking to me about machine learning and AI, and started with DonorSearch and DonorSearch AI. And I'm like, my gosh, because then my mind went to, once I understood what was possible and what nonprofits, A, because the price point was coming down, and B, what the ahas were in the data, he taught me to flip the entire equation from just being I put my hand up for 21 years. I would do consulting based on the value of the dollars, the value of the potential donations in someone's database. When you start thinking about the relationship side of it first, it changes everything. And then from a strategy standpoint, from a communication standpoint, from an engagement standpoint, you realize, wow, we might not be doing this the right way or the best way. And that's, I think, the yin and yang that was happening when we were writing this book.
So I'm imagining that even though you came to this with your own ideas and then you worked together in developing those ideas, that you might have had some kind of epiphany in this process, right?
Absolutely, for me. Yeah.
So, but I shouldn't, that would be a big reveal. So I'm not going to reveal that yet. We are going to get to that part later. I'm also going to invite you to participate in the conversation. And unlike in many of our sessions, my laptop is far away from me and I don't have very long arms. So I would to encourage you to at least let us know that you're here. If you would just write in the chat, hello, maybe which city and state you're from or which organization, we'd really love that. We can see that on the screen that's opposed to us right now. And if you have questions, I want to encourage those. So please do go ahead and feel free to pose those at any point. We will be able to see them and we will weave these into the conversation. I know that you won't be able to ask about the book because the book is just coming out. So the two of you have just spent, I don't know how many hours signing about 700 copies of this thing, but the release is tomorrow. Is that correct? The official release?
Yeah, National Philanthropy Day.
National Philanthropy Day.
Yeah.
So maybe to flip this on its head and then dive into the book itself, when you decided to release a book like this on National Philanthropy Day, I'm sure one of the intentions was, let's make sure the book gets some attention, sure. But maybe one of the other intentions is to accomplish something. Yeah. So looking at this at 30,000 feet, you write this book, you put it out there in the world, you want people to read it, but what do you hope that it reveals for others?
Well, on the awareness piece, can I be honest about that? It was about 5 months ago, when we realized working with our publisher that November 15th would be the launch date. I remember I got a text one night from Nathan who's like, "Are you sitting down? It's actually National Philanthropy Day." So yeah. I wish we had more foresight.
Actually, we were pushing the publisher because we were supposed to release like the first or second week of December.
Correct.
Gosh, it's so late. And so we got them to move to November 17th or 15th.
Yep.
So different days, November 15th, and Sarah Tedesco, like she's on her calendar, who you DonorSearch, she's like, it's National Philanthropy Day. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's meant to be. It's meant to be. And National Philanthropy Day for me is significant importance because it was created by Doug Freeman in Orange County where I live. And so National Philanthropy Day is celebrated on the 17th in Orange County this year, but it started there by his work, flying to Washington, D.C. like 50 times, to lobby Reagan, to have this day. So, and it's kind of juxtaposed because it's like the generosity crisis on national philanthropy sounds like an oxymoron, but this is actually really a book of hope. I mean, going back to your question of like, what do we hope it inspires? Sure. We hope it inspires conversation about generosity, and that will never get sick of. I mean, that's
right. Well, this leads us to what the book is about, because if you haven't read it, which I'm sure is true, but I hope you will, this book is about a crisis. So describe that crisis for us. What is the generosity crisis? Why is it important? Why should we care?
Yeah. So, I mean, in broad strokes, I'll go, and then Brian jumps in. Any business, no matter what kind of business, if you have a negative trajectory that looks like this, over time in any time series, there's a trend line that looks like this, like it should get your attention, right?
Yes.
It'd be like, what is going on? And, been actually watching and studying, the percentage of households that give since 2010, and Giving USA does a great job, obviously of giving us this really rich data. I mean, US is so fortunate to have that body of work, and decided to model that out. Like, where does this trend line end? Like, if you just you continue that down, in the last 20 years, there's been a 16% decline in the percentage of households that give. Where does that end? And, as Brian and I were going through this, we're like, this ends in 49 years. Like, this isn't like
not 109.
No, like in 49 years, the number of households that give is either 0 or in the single digits. Like that's a horrifying thing. And then I knew that intuitively, because working in a nonprofit, every year it was getting harder. Like, we were still hitting goals and exceeding our goals, but from a shrinking pool of donors. So it's getting harder. Clients that I know you work with, it's like getting harder. So you can't just pretend that nothing's happening.
Yeah, and to exactly that point, during the writing of this, I would be talking to clients or potential clients, and I had one potential client or chairman of the board say to me, it is the definition of insanity. We're hitting our head against the wall every year and it's not working anymore. Like, what's happening? Almost like this cry out for this unbelievable not-for-profit. And going back to your other question, I mean, sparking a conversation, I think what this, on 2 levels, really 3, if I could go. One is at the board level of nonprofits. To Nathan's point, if many of them are in corporate or they run businesses or work for brands, not all, but many, if they saw that trend line in their business, they wouldn't not address it. They wouldn't be not speaking about it.
Right.
They would be going full force at it. So, and not every nonprofit is on that trajectory, but the overall is not a good picture. And I think it has to start in that boardroom of nonprofits for true change to happen. I think even we write about the role of corporations, and I think so often on that side of the house, the CSR, the head of the foundation, the head of ESG has to fight internally to explain why this is valuable, right? And I want them to have this book as air cover as well, because it talks about not only companies are doing it really well, but ultimately when nonprofits and corporates are partnering together. To me, it's the ultimate 1 + 1 = 5. And so I'm hoping we hope this book hits, is as important to the development director, to the head of a nonprofit, to the board member of a nonprofit, to the head of the CSR program. And quite frankly, in that ecosystem, we can all start to learn from each other and start to address this in all of our areas that we can.
Oh, I will say though, too, we struggle with the title of the book, for a while, because writing a book with a seemingly negative title, it's not something you do to make friends. Like, I mean, right? I mean, it's not like, we don't see a lot of these books ending up in stockings unless you have a really Scrooge uncle that you're like throwing this in there. But at the end of the day, we talked with our publisher, Wiley has been fantastic. I mean, this is a book to call attention. Over the last several years, when we started this process a few years ago, no one wanted to talk about this. Like, it was really unpopular to talk about the generosity crisis, the giving crisis. And frankly, when Drew Lindsay from the Chronicle of Philanthropy broke the story in July, like our book was already done at that point, it was like, oh my gosh, it's okay to talk about, and so it's become definitely more in vogue in the last year to address this. I mean, no one likes a crisis. Like, I mean, we'd all be much better off if there were none, but there's different ways of dealing with that. And we just felt like.
But for those who don't know what this crisis is, we're talking about, I know from the time that I get involved in fundraising, about 70 to 75% of the population according to whatever statistics we had 20, 30 years ago, was involved in what we
Right.
consider traditional philanthropy, right? Giving
Yeah.
cash, donation of some form to a not-for-profit. And then that has declined to around 49.6%
yeah.
or something like that in the space of
Yeah.
less than 20 years. So if that's true, and you say the trajectory is like this, why are people having a tough time talking about this? If this were a corporation, to your point, and you saw that suddenly nobody's buying salsa anymore, I hope we can talk about salsa, that if nobody's buying salsa or it's suddenly gone in half, then wouldn't they say, oh my God, we got to stop producing salsa, or we got to produce better salsa, or we got to redistribute salsa? Why are the boards and the development directors and the donors not pushing on this topic?
You know, and this is a tough one because it's a general answer, but in some instances, because the overall number, the amount of money that's been given, it, within reason, continues to go up. It kind of hides the undercurrent of the lack of participation, the numbers you were talking about. And so that has, and it's unfair because, you know, when you think about the articles that are written every year around Giving USA's data coming out, it's usually something along the lines of giving's up again, right? And so I know I go into board meetings with our nonprofit clients and board members are like, well, why aren't our numbers up?
Yeah.
And not real, you see, so it became, that was a little bit of the sort of the dirty laundry that, well, no, it must be we're the ones struggling, nobody else is. Yeah. And I go into a lot of nonprofits internally and work with them and their boards, they're all struggling. They're all struggling, and just a question of to some degree. And yes, a big gift may cover it up, but the underpinnings are tough.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to get to the data that we're really talking about, I mean, it's kind of like looking through the footnotes of Giving USA's report, because if giving is still 2.1% of the GDP, and every year, like, people are high-fiving each other when the report comes out, you know, it's really masked this issue for quite a while. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, Giving USA does different reports talking about the percentage of households that give. So who's making up that total is shifting. We're going back to an era of Rockefeller and Carnegie, like this, you know, the philanthropic capitalism, it's like full circle. I mean, Bezos this morning talked about giving away at least half of his money while he's alive when he was asked in an interview. So generosity is there. I think our biggest criticism over the last 2 years has been, well, we're living in the most generous time of ever. Like, this is the golden age of philanthropy, because either people are giving in different ways, or they're buying responsibly, or doing things that kind of mirror some of those feel-good kind of visceral reactions, or the monetary is going up, which we know is not the case. So you know, it's a little different than in Europe. So I was talking to someone in the UK who did a big report on the economy and philanthropy. There they have a decline in donors and in dollars. So you can't really hide from it as much.
And they haven't been as committed to the top of the pyramid kind of capital campaign. Let's get the big donors as we have. Right. They've been very good on the street.
Exactly.
And with direct marketing. So, wow, what is, I know that because a huge chunk of the book, you can't see what my fingers are doing, but a big chunk of the book is going through and describing all the kind of the pain points in our sector, what we haven't done right. But if you were to break it down into 2 or 3 things that are highlights, kind of the highlight reel of things that people are, for lack of a better phrase, doing wrong right now to engage with donors, meet them where they are, what might those things be? What are we doing so terribly wrong?
I mean, well, you'll add more specificity to this. You know, there's actually two bodies of work in this. We actually break them out in the book from both external and internal. Right. You know, external, like decline in religious association. I mean, where people have learned about generosity, it's shrinking like 6% per year. So less people are learning about the virtues of giving, and political divide and all types of other external things. Corporations that are they're kind of stolen the show. Like Elon Musk is talking about how all of his companies are philanthropy, using those words. So there's external, but I have to take responsibility in the nonprofit sector. Like, nonprofits are not just the victim. Like, I mean, there's parts of how nonprofits are evaluated. So like, you know, running by cost per dollar raise. So you're trying to squeeze every penny out. You're not innovating and things like that. Those are systemic issues that boards need to address, the CEOs need to address, and they need to think about things like retention over revenue, you know, relationships over revenue. And so, you know, it's a mix of both those external factors and the internal factors. But, you know, I've never met anyone who disagreed when I asked, well, what do you think nonprofits, how far do they lag behind the for-profit sector? Oh, 10 years. They might disagree with you. How many years? Right. 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever it might be. Well, we're living in this era of precision. Like this is literally the era of precision and personalization driven by AI. And so my work in AI started as a means to an end. It's like we were losing donors, so we had to find a new way to find new, better, not just more donors, but better donors. And so part of that is the slowness to adopt. I mean, we were just talking about this before. I mean, 25% of nonprofits are using any form of AI. It's like 97% of for-profits. So there's just a massive gap. But we actually go into a lot of detail. I don't know what your observations are on that.
Yeah, I mean, no, just to build upon where you were too, the confluence of factors. I think some of the factors have been evolving in terms of putting the pressure on nonprofits, and some of it is that personalization. There's something, unfortunately, that a lot of nonprofits struggle with, in that when they reach out to donors or potential supporters, it somehow comes across, because Amazon knows us intimately and knows what time to hit us with the ad to buy Red Sox on a Tuesday, and a nonprofit might write "Dear donor" or "Dear supporter," and oh my gosh, the visceral reaction.
Dear friend.
But can you imagine, right? And it's not, there's that innovation question, there's that budget question, but it's unfortunate because it creates a divide, it creates a psychological thing, which is what happened in. This really started to pick up speed in the after the 07-08 financial crisis, where people had a very depressionary mindset of a recession. People had a very visceral reaction of, I have to change my spending, giving habits, and it's never kicked back in. And I think some of the things that in that time frame, in that that companies and brands have been able to do to continue to, at Nathan's point, fast forward their knowledge of us, fast forward the way they communicate with us. Nonprofits have unfortunately been lagging behind in that.
Yeah.
I wonder fundamentally if that's a problem of resources. That's what I hear a lot, or if it's really orientation. Because some people will say, well, we don't have the software, we don't have the staff, we don't know how. Are these all legitimate complaints? Is it that they don't have the same on-ramp as our corporate friends have, or have they just not made the decision?
Yeah, that's an important question. I think every nonprofit has the ability to do, because we've done them with our clients, to do surveying of all kinds. I mean, but I'm talking about.
So if you're a little social service agency, or you're $300 million
Correct,
NGO?
yeah.
Okay.
Correct. And and surveys, when we used to do them with our clients for years, used to always mostly be about money. But it's very fascinating what happened as we started shifting. So if we're asking 20 questions, 15 or 16 might be about you, Jay, and about like, what do you care about? What are your interests?
Right.
Because if you think about it, if you respond and you answer those questions, I now have a much more holistic view about who you are as a person,
Sure.
what your interest areas are. So I might be able to better align just my outreach to you, verbally, written. And we've seen some tremendous success happen just out of basic surveys. And I think that, and forgetting what Nathan can do and everything else with DonorSearch and AI, but so I struggle a bit with it. We don't have enough resources for that, because I think there's an engagement opportunity that nonprofits can be better at.
And and I think there is a mind shift that has happened where, I started fundraising pre-GuideStar, when it was literally just trust. Like, I mean, GuideStar is a really good thing because it added, credibility to what we were offering, and there's some validation. But before GuideStar, people forget like how relational philanthropy was. Like it was all just one-on-one. Like, I mean, it was, and you had to, I had to fulfill my promise to you, and you were a partner and all those things. I think the last 20 years, the pendulum has swung so far to automation that like those relationships just got lost. And I think nonprofits have gotten into this mindset because we don't think back 20 years. We just think in the last year or 2 years, like, and we're trying to catch up, is that there's this mentality that more is better, that technology can scale to get you more. But we have a huge retention issue in this industry. Like the corporate world would never, ever, people literally just get fired across an entire floor if retention was 19 or 21% for a subscription type business. Like, so we have a retention issue because we're just focused on more. I do feel like with Mackenzie Scott and some of the other just recent conversations, the kind of resurgence of trust-based philanthropy is coming back a little bit. So I do feel like this like we're getting away from just more. What AI does is it allows us to focus on better, because your lifetime value of a donor that stays with you is 15 times a donor that's going to give you one time. I worked for 20 years of my career and lost so much money acquiring new donors, acquire a donor at any cost, versus focus on who are the people we know. How do we get to know them more intimately through surveys and things like that? those are the people that will stay with us for the longest period of time. So I do think that mindset is shifting back a little bit. I'm hoping, and I think it starts with some of this awareness of like, where did we get here? Like, how did we get here? Like, how is it that retention is between 19 and 20% on average? And, and the idea is that the value of your database is not how much wealth you have. It's about the level of connection you have in your database. How do you activate people that you already have? They'll go the distance with you if you pour into them. People want to be connected. I mean, that really is the whole second half of our book.
Well, and even before we get into the second half, you said something in the book that I wanted to make sure I address, because it's come up in other places where people talk about this subject, although kind of glancingly, because as you say, it's been not a popular thing to say we're, our hair's on fire, even though we're losing a lot of donors who support our work. And that is that you said philanthropy at its core is about connection, not money. Just an echo of what you were just saying a moment ago. But others have claimed that generosity measured by money, well, that's the wrong measure. That we've heard this from other places, and very smart, committed people in our sector. They'll say, well, there's more money coming from crowdfunding campaigns. That isn't measured here. Or they'll say volunteerism is up, or remittances are a good example of this in the United States, that to other countries, and there are half a dozen examples that people give, and they say, you know what, maybe we're just measuring the wrong things. Maybe we're focused on the wrong things. Yeah. But I wonder about that. And I wonder if you can take me through why it's a risk to try and potentially change the rules of the field, or where the goalposts are.
Probably the most important topic right now, and Brian will be happy to talk about it in detail. We get this. We get it
a lot. I mean, there are studies that show you that the younger generation, the one behind us and the one coming up behind them, are in fact more generous than they, generations have ever been. Right. You hit on all the really important points, because it is being redefined. I actually do think it's being redefined. I think being generous is being redefined. You talk about crowdfunding, which doesn't get counted, per se. I mean, what's interesting about that crowdfunding is, I don't know the exact data point, but there's a fair amount I've got to believe is if, you had some troubles and we all rallied to support you, we're giving to each other. There's not that mechanism of an organization that we're going through, there's nothing, that's phenomenal. Right? I think the way you can purchase from companies that are doing great things, their products, that's awesome. You can invest now in certain, funds that are having benefits. I jokingly said to people 25 years ago, if you wanted to be generous, you really had one option, which was to support a nonprofit. Now the menu of options to be generous has grown. And I think that's great, unless you're the head of a nonprofit who's trying to balance the budget. And I love that you said earlier, Jay, traditional philanthropy is what we're talking, is under stress. And that's what we're trying to get the conversation started about.
Well, so to go back to that then, is that a problem? Is traditional philanthropy the problem? Because we've also heard that argued that, philanthropy is just wrong. The real problem is there needs to be more support for government. Government needs to be more representative, that what we consider philanthropy today should really be community-centered. So what's wrong with that argument?
There's nothing wrong with it. The question is, I think the ground rules, I think you said that term earlier, that we're playing under. I jokingly said to Nathan after a speech I gave a couple weeks ago, I was in the cab going back to the airport, and I said, until they change the definition of currency, until they change the definition, I said, I'm not trying to not have that argument, but I think we all work with so many wonderful nonprofits that until that changes, they got to keep the lights on, they got to continue to do their mission. Now, an interesting conversation came up at the speech about, do we have too many nonprofits? Do we?
1.8 million now?
Right.
So, yes.
Yeah, only like
in the US alone.
It doubled in the last 20 years, So that's an interesting conversation. But again, that's not going to be solved tomorrow either. And I think we've got so many issues that the currency question is real. I would love to have that conversation and move our industry around that whole concept. But until that such time, I think we have to try to keep a foot in the new and a foot in the old, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I will say too, from from someone who spent, especially I think about my early days in nonprofit, I was working at Boys and Girls Club. Like, we knew our community and can solve issues in our community far better than the city could. The city helped us to a very small extent, but we knew, because we were a trusted neutral party. They did not trust the city. The city actually owned a teen center that no teens would go to because it was the man, but they would go to the Boys and Girls Club, which was safe haven for 3 different gangs. And so, I think nonprofits inherently can do things that government can't do because they have the vested interest in that nonprofit is the community that they serve. So, again, money is one measure, just one measure, and we understand that when we're talking about in this book is really traditional nonprofits, which serve a unique purpose. When we hear that the other side of it is just, we're living in the golden era of generosity. People are more generous than ever in just different ways. I mean, I did a lot of my education is in macroeconomics. And if I look at things like homelessness and food insecurity, if we were in the most generous society we've ever lived in, and humanity was, spewing out generosity in all different ways, those two things would be declining. The two key factors would be declining, but they're not. So if we were the most generous society that we've ever been, we would see declines and not increases in some of those basic humanitarian needs. So I think there's a lot more study that needs to be done. I mean, I think this is a long-term thing. The Generosity Commission is studying this, and a lot of other groups are. But yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, generosity is a very squishy, but it's something that impacts all of us. But many of us just take for granted. We don't even think about what it is and how it manifests itself.
Okay, so that I do want to ask you about this too, but I want to make sure I'm not missing people who might be listening and have a question. The only one that I see that's up here right now is talking about whether or not this crisis is due to donors becoming more savvy on how to hide their giving. And we were talking about that a bit with crowdfunding, but DAFs are something that come up in these sessions a lot. And I don't want to take aim at DAFs or to applaud them, but just to make sure we address it, sort of like Bitcoin, because you were talking about currency. So my mind went there. Well, what about Bitcoin? So do we have an issue with the mechanisms of philanthropy that are either hiding what people are inclined to do, or are we actually just potentially confusing the landscape by creating the equivalent of like a German restaurant menu with 50 pages, maybe Cheesecake Factory on, maybe I shouldn't say that. Anyway, some kind of restaurant with lots of pages and a menu that make it difficult for people to figure out what to do.
Why don't you answer the DAF part? Well, you go first, and then
I think it's more we're confusing the marketplace. I think I lean more so there. The DAF question is a very real one. I mean, I can't remember the latest number, but it's 120 billion, 125 billion that's sitting in DAFs, right? Sure. Already earmarked for philanthropy, but for not-for-profits, but hasn't made it its way there. I think they're still running at like a 22-23% give out rate, so they're much higher,
which is huge thanks to foundations, but yes,
which is huge. And so I'm hopeful of what DAFs can do, and mainly because I was saying to Nathan last week, there a couple of our not-for-profits that are big, like association related nonprofits, have created their own DAFs, and for very low entry fees, I think like $1,000 or something like that. Oh, wow. And we're hearing that what those folks are doing is teaching their children. So if we could give each of them, each of the children $50, where do they want to give it? Why do they want to give it? They're having them around this time of year to go through that exit. If that's happening, oh my gosh, that would make my day, to be honest.
Yeah. No, I mean, last two nonprofits I worked in created their own DAFs because they wanted to meet their donors, where we're at. If we were only using Giving USA data to show this decline in generosity, then I'd be concerned. But, we look at Gallup as well, and Gallup has a much more inclusive survey tool to determine are people becoming more or less generous, which is, you walk outside of a grocery store and a poll worker asks you, do you donate to, are you philanthropic, or do you donate to charity, or do you help someone? And your definition might be, yeah, I gave $5 to someone on the street. Even with Gallup, in their more kind of generous view, there's still a 13% decline versus a 16% decline that Giving USA has. So it's not just, it's not just dollars, and it's not just maybe donors hiding, but it's the state of mind of Americans. And this is not even a new issue at all. Putnam in his book, Bowling Alone, started looking at this in detail from World War II. People in America have become a bit more atomized,
Yeah, and I wonder about this in the context of not just the present, but the future. So we're sitting here in beautiful New York. They just put up a tree for us. I know that was your joke, but I wanted to borrow it. And so there's a lot happening here, but you can see that there is a change in New York when you walk through the streets of New York, and I suspect you can see it where you live. So there's some strains on the system, and we're feeling it not just in our household budgets, but we're seeing it in other ways. So I guess one of the questions is there a reason why people need to do something definitive about this now? Especially because if we've been able to see the numbers rise, at least in Giving USA, those numbers keep rising, but we see it's from a smaller and smaller group of wealthier and wealthier people because of this wealth inequality, at least in the United States. what might happen if we see a major correction? I mean, I know we went from 36 to 33 and so forth, but what happens if we see a major correction or a major correction in the real estate market or some kind of roll up of companies? What's going to happen to our marketplace for donors?
I mean, history tells us the last time we were at this high inflation point, it was a 9% drop the year next year. So it was one of the, I think, the biggest 1 year, year-over-year drop, or 2 year with philanthropy. And we're talking about 72 to 75. So that is something we've been talking about. We've been, we know that's a possibility on the horizon, to be very honest. And same with the stock market, or the real estate, going back to the 07, 09. So all these shocks to the economic system definitely have effects on our, on our giving and what have you. I come at it from a standpoint of, and I know this is a very broad base, but the world we're living in right now, we have the highest level of people feeling isolated from one another. There's trust at low levels, happiness is at low levels. I just spoke to a nonprofit this morning who took me through, unfortunately, the mental health and suicide rates, which is I was not as aware as I should have been, and those numbers are scary, especially if you've got 4 young kids myself. Generosity and giving and helping another human being is actually the antidote to all of this. And so I know that's not where you want to probably go with this conversation, but like, if you want to be selfish about it, actually do something for others. We might have a chance of peace in this world back together, regardless of the financial crisis up or down that may or may not be there. I think we've got to start talking more about, and we were talking about this earlier, more about the benefits of giving, and because quite frankly, it's the answer to so many problems we're having.
Yeah, I mean, that is the paradox of generosity: is the more you give, the more you get back. And I do think, as we talk about in the book, the Edelman Trust Barometer, and that corporations are trusted more than nonprofits, which is horrible. But at the end of the day, when people trust less externally outward, they tend to move inward. I think there's a yearning for people to be connected again. Like, I think with all of those things that we just talked about in the world, anxiety and happiness and all this, people are craving community. And Arthur Brooks, who we're just so fortunate, wrote our first testimonial for this book. He's a New York Times bestselling author, Harvard professor. He wrote this thing in the New York Times that, the US is facing a crisis of love. Well, literally by definition, philanthropy, the love for mankind, is all about, like, to Brian's point, the antidote is literally right in front of us to all those, big societal issues. Now, it may take other forms and fashions. It may require lots of novel partnerships and consolidations, even if there's too many nonprofits. But whatever, I do think that nonprofits have an opportunity in these times of stress to prove to people that when we said, we want your partnership, that we actually meant it. In those times of stress, and even if we're going through an economic downturn, that's literally how you prove to a person that you meant what you said.
As you're talking about this, it strikes me that's almost dead center in the book, where you talk about the Trust Edelman survey and also about happiness, which you were just talking about, and those two things and their linkage. That's something we've known for a long time, but sometimes knowing what's wrong with you and then knowing how to get the medicine or that you can trust to take it is the hard part. So without giving away everything that's in the book or everything that might follow it later, how are you recommending that people overcome this, whether it's because they're afraid and the market might crash, or whether it's because they really want to have that engagement that we all desire and hope for? How do we take those steps? If you're a small social service agency somewhere, how are you going to find out how to truly engage with people instead of using them like ATM machines?
Well, I want to say something. Brian, in probably about, I don't know how far along we were in the book, and he's like, you know what, like, we're in this competition for connection. Like, and it was like, I mean, just those words were like, you're right,
really interesting.
And so we spent a lot of time since then, even as like today, I mean, we just continually talk about this, is that, a person's ability, your empathy is a limited quantity, right? You cannot feel the same way about every brand, every nonprofit, every person. You can't feel the same way. That understanding that your competition, your ability to connect is a limited quantity, or your most precious commodity, is like the first step. Because I think we take donors for granted a lot. I don't think we think that a donor can only connect with 12 different organizations in this visceral way. like that's a very sacred place to be when you're one of those, 12, and the 12 is probably a lot. That's probably too many. So, I mean, I think that's where it comes down to, like, if I was back, in my Boys and Girls Club seat, rather than trying to boil the ocean and just acquire more donors at any cost, I would go internally and be like, where's my core people that I'm one of their 12. Like, I'm one of those 12 organizations that they really care about, and go the distance with them. There's more value in building deep, I mean, from an ROI perspective, there's more value in building those types of relationships with a smaller group of people than just finding, an endless group of new people that might give you one gift. Mm-hmm. And then frankly, you'll disappoint because you don't have the infrastructure to continue to foster that type of relationship with them over time. So I don't know, you should, the competition for connection is such a big deal, and that's what corporations have gotten really good at.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting data point that Nathan would hit me one time that said, you realize that the average person gets more than 330 emails a day, sees how many ads, right?
5 to 10,000 ads a day. In New York, it's probably like quadruple, so.
Right, and then couple that with, we as human beings have now the attention span that equates to 8.25 seconds, which is actually less than goldfish now.
Well, I hope you stay here with us more than 8.25 seconds, by the way.
But if you factor that into this crunch, no surprise, we're distracted, we're disoriented, we get, and I go back to Nathan's point, which is more is not more, less is more, especially during a difficult economic environment. Okay. This is going to be a horrific, shameless plug, but there's a story in the book about my fascination, is that one word, Nathan, for it, of Pearl Jam, the band. And the band tell the story of being around now 30 years. Mm-hmm. They talk about what's helped them maintain that time to be a band that long. And there's a middle period where I know this, where they talk about often where nobody cared about them anymore. They would put out albums, they would barely get on the air, wouldn't be on the cover of Rolling Stone. And certain people like myself were still showing up at the shows and getting great seats for $20 because nobody cared, and except for this core group. And then I came roaring back, and now I'm in the nosebleeds at Madison Square Garden. But they will turn around and say it was that group of fans who stuck with them during that difficult time. It's back to what you said, that really, they said, gave them the motivation, the energy to keep going. And I think for me, I lived through that. I knew when people are like, you're still listening to them? And now everyone's like getting those tickets before me, but that's a whole nother.
So by the way, if Eddie Vedder is listening right now, or shout out to Simon Townsend, we're watching you. Yes. This is, I guess, ultimately one of the challenges is that people are going to ask a question that we had here in the chat, and I'm not watching the time, so I should do that. But top strategies to help with donor retention, a question that comes up a lot, and it gets, I think, in a way, the tactical representation of this question about, or maybe just the metrics of it. How is it that we demonstrate that we've actually got people in what Jerry Panos used to call our hug? Yeah. So how do we do it, and how do we prove that we've done it?
Well, I actually think it starts at a higher level. I think it's the metric of success of a nonprofit needs to stop being measured only by dollars. I think unless you solve for that, the motivations won't be there. I managed gift officers most of my career and direct response. And, if your motivation is just to fill the bucket every year, you have no incentive, to really truly be donor centric. So I think it first starts with a metric, a key metric, not revenue, but how many people, of course you want a net increase because you'll lose people over time, just attrition anyway. But how many people are you staying with you, and how are you moving the needle on that? I think if you do that, I think every human that works in nonprofit is creative enough and has enough empathy to build a relationship with someone. There's lots of great creative strategies out there, but honestly, I think we've overcomplicated it. I think people absolutely have that understanding of what it takes to be loved.
Why? Why are we overcomplicated?
I think our metric of success is wrong. I think we've made revenue the end goal. Hard stop.
So we keep looking at the thermometer instead of paying attention to any of the rest of the symptoms or something?
Right. Because what's the incentive of a gift officer? You acquire a new donor, you've got to fill your goal so that you don't get fired. What's your incentive to continue to foster that relationship other than being a good citizen until next year or the year after if someone made a multi-year pledge? So it really is, flipping the pyramid again, getting away from, more is more, but, and really diving in. But that definition of success has to change. Nothing will change in our sector if we only measure success by revenue.
And that's why I think I said it earlier. It's important that this conversation be had in the boardrooms, because even really proactive CEOs of nonprofits will need the board's approval to start to think about the development office and its tactics differently. There's no doubt about it. The other thing I would just point out, very practical level, in the Nathan mentioned him earlier, but Drew Lindsay from the Chronicle of Philanthropy, the Giving Crisis that he wrote in July had some wonderful examples of what we what we would call radical connection. One of the major gift officers for the Houston Food Bank, there's a whole write-up of some phenomenal work she did at connecting with the people that were in, I think, what was fairly dormant, sleepy portfolio. She was given to see what she could make of it, and she really made of it. But it all comes down to the human relationship that she built with everybody.
Yeah, I do want to ask you about this, because it's been, at least in the media, a lot recently about these kind of light connections, that people have that are that people attribute much of people's happiness, or at least satisfaction with life, to having also a large network of light connections. I just want to ask you, if you are advising nonprofits to really double down on the connections they're building with the people that they can predict care about the same things, and therefore welcome them into the fold, regardless of whether they're giving $12 or $120,000, build those relationships. If I'm hearing you correctly, you're not saying don't have those important connections with the others too.
Right.
Because things emerge on their own time, right? You're still like going.
You've got it right. It's not an either or issue. It's an and issue. You have to continue to build a pipeline of more people. I mean, it's something that in nonprofit we've always known, is that people that have shared values stay with us, right? If you meet a donor, you get to know a donor, or someone gives to you because they believe in what you're doing, because they have a backstory, because they, you work in food insecurity, but they grew up food insecure, like they're going to stay with you because you have shared values. It doesn't, the dollar amount doesn't matter. We've always believed that. We've always known that to be true intuitively as nonprofit professionals. Now we have technology that allows us to measure that. And so I think the big difference is that we don't, I mean, just to run off intuition is very expensive. You don't have enough gift officers, right, to like go to lunch with every donor every day. But we now can measure, are people opening up these emails? Are they watching a video? Are they sharing it? Are they the same thing that Amazon does? We can do that, and we can do surveys to really get to know, people more at scale. So technology exists to really help kind of ratify that intuition that we have, but again, being okay with losing, some, it has to go from, look, the world is not your oyster. Only 49% of Americans make gifts to begin with. On average hospital, only 2% of patients give to a hospital, only 2% on average. So it's using data to understand those that are aligned in your values. How else do you do that? I mean, there's really no other way to do that at any cost-effective way.
There are examples in this book that are worth reading the book for, frightening things kind of at the beginning of the chapters, including an experience that a co-author who we haven't mentioned, that's why I'm mentioning this now, Michael Ashley, who is not with us today, talks about his own experience as a graduate of a university, and how he feels about the school as a result of whether or not they've developed this deep bond, this connection. And it's really important to read. And then writ large, when you move away from the one person we know to these bigger examples of hospitals, like community hospitals, this really has a massive financial impact. You're talking about what percentage of a budget for a community hospital?
I mean, as a total, most hospitals are billion-dollar enterprises, but in terms of profitability of a hospital, like true EBITDA, philanthropy can be 30% of like true profit of a hospital, depending on the hospital. So it's what we would call, I worked in healthcare, as you know, for quite a while. It's what we call the margin of excellence. It's the difference between providing those ancillary services to people that you couldn't otherwise.
Which is where I was going next, because some people might argue, you know what, okay, we can do these things, but it's going to be hard.
Right.
And doing the hard thing might mean that we aren't doing something we know that currently works.
Mm-hmm.
Be it, focusing on a few people give us a lot of money for the moment, that's working. And so for those who make that argument, and you are able to look a little bit into the crystal ball for organizations like hospitals, or right here in New York, you've got a lot of arts institutions where the budget might be 60% of the budget is coming from contributions.
For sure.
This is a big deal. And it's not like they're going to find a new way of generating revenue, right? Or are they? Is that going to be one argument that, you know what, it's not that they're inefficient. It's not that we have to rely on philanthropy. We just have to find a new way of doing business. How do you counter that argument, especially when the corporations have done this so well?
Yeah, I mean, there are some nonprofits who've actually figured out a different revenue model over time, or they've tried different things, and I think that's wonderful. I don't necessarily think it's right for every nonprofit. I think, you know, the ability to, as Nathan was talking about earlier, I mean, to your point, it's the end question, right? So take the arts institutions. There could be, I'm making up the number, 15 major supporters of them, and obviously they've got to stay close to them and have really. But if you now look down the pipeline, because we did this before I even met Nathan, that's why the timing when I met him was so perfect. We were able to help a higher education client of ours begin to figure out who in their law school setting was on the verge of becoming partner. And it had and it was significant. It was the equivalent of them here in New York going from $300,000 a year, which in of itself is a nice salary, to $900,000 if they made partner. So we were able to figure out on a very basic level, it's not even what he does now, there's probably, I'll make up the number, 700 who are in that category. And so we said to the alumni relations team, why don't we get to know them now, like in a year or 2 or 3, before they're even eligible for partner? Because we didn't want them saying, you only called me when I made partner. We wanted to have really true relationships with them, hopefully with their law firm, for internships, pipeline development. And so it's looking and caring for the top of the funnel, if you will, the top of the pyramid, but being smarter, being more creative and more efficient with the efforts, instead of the spray and pray approach of, well, nobody's coming to our events. Why don't we go talk to these 400 people who could be really helpful to us in the future?
I do worry about nonprofits that are putting all the eggs. So we see a lot of nonprofits putting more eggs in the ultra high net worth basket. It's like ROI, at the end of the day, though, that the competition for those dollars is significant. I mean, like the numbers that we hear now are just amazing. But, like corporations that, have other, goals for success as well, these if you put all of those eggs in a small basket, this paper came out, or a study came out the other day, that less people have signed the giving pledge in the last year than since it started, because we're going into this inflationary period. A lot of people want to, a lot of ultra high net worth people make most of their money in recessionary periods. They leverage themselves, they double down, they come out ahead over and over again. So what happens when, people just aren't as generous over here anymore because they don't feel valued, and then all of a sudden that part dries up for a period? Like, it's kind of a risky. I mean, trying to be diversified is key. But one of the parts that I'm just super encouraged by, we talk about in the book a little bit, it would definitely be in a follow-up, is the rise of B corporations. And actually nonprofits that will launch B corporations to kind of feed the pool. Like, that's innovative. Like, that's pretty cool. So I mean, it is getting creative and thinking of new ways to not just, to have your cake and eat it too. There are a lot of different options now that exist to do good that aren't just through traditional 501c3s.
You're answering the question I would have asked you kind of to end it all, which is not so much a tactical one. So I want to thank those who have been asking things like, where do you find those donors? And that's something I know that both of you can address independently. You'll be talking about not only through this book, but in your work. So before I ask kind of a final question, if people want to learn more about either of you and your firms, how can they find you? How should they reach out to you?
Well, for me, LinkedIn, just find me on LinkedIn. I bet on LinkedIn years ago, and it's been a great place. I love my LinkedIn community. I mean, I've met so many interesting people that want to do good in the world. So, I mean, truly connect with me and we'll hang out. And then, of course, DonorSearch, DonorSearch.net. And yeah.
Same for me, LinkedIn, definitely. And then Changing Our World. Yeah, both of the places. But, Nathan a few months ago, actually, when we knew this was coming out, also created a Generosity Crisis LinkedIn page as well. So we've got a small community emerging there. Yeah. And I know there's some other great communities, but LinkedIn for both of us is terrific. Right.
And I know you were just talking about, in a way, although you didn't phrase it this way, kind of what gives you some hope. Mm-hmm. And you use one example, these B Corps, but just to kind of end on that note, is there something that's giving you hope as you came out of this and you've found the crisis and you found some solutions, but you're looking beyond this? It's not one book, it's a whole, it's kind of a movement. So what keeps you energized as you work with that?
Really on two levels. One is, we talked about earlier, the changing definition of generosity and of philanthropy and B Corps and Patagonia flipping. And people are really getting creative because if you think about what do we need to do to solve the problem, whatever that problem is, and is philanthropy one piece of the puzzle and not necessarily the entire puzzle? I think that's what's exciting because people are beginning to think differently. But I will say, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, or even going back as we've been writing this book, as I get in one-off conversations with friends, family members, people, it's exciting I know it's a crisis, as you said earlier, but the more we talk about it, the more people either say, oh my gosh, I never realized we were down to 49.6%, or I never realized the massive role nonprofits play in our society. That spark of a conversation, that's how movements have started in the past. And so I'm hopeful that traditional philanthropy, as we jokingly said, we hope this title never has to be used again, because philanthropy in the crisis is completely flipped on its head. But I'm also excited just by people realizing that we want to live in a better world and solving those problems regardless of where the answers come from.
Well, it's so funny because I just was reminded of this. We actually considered the title, The Generosity Crisis, a book of hope. And I mean, the subtitle is A Case for Radical Connection to Solve Humanity's Greatest Challenges, but it really, we wanted it to be a book of hope. And, I think for me, that hope comes from, in probably two ways. I mean, I think generosity is a pro-social behavior. Like, people are inherently generous, but when they don't feel connected to something, they won't give. There's too many barriers that keep them from giving. So I also think, we live in such a divided world, and almost any topic seems to be taboo, like politics and religion and whatever you want to talk about. But generosity is not. Like, I actually enjoy my conversations with people who don't give, and they feel safe. Like, I've never had a conversation around generosity that went bad. And that's hard to say about a lot of topics. Like why? And that's really interesting. And and you hear like all these different things of how, like, well, I gave one time and I never heard back, or whatever it might be. I mean, I think we have to get outside of our bubble and to really learn where people are at. But I think it's a safe topic for people to talk about. And I mean, that does give me hope. And, we talk about this in the book, but I mean, generosity is better caught than taught. And so, you can try to teach generosity, but like, if you're showing it, it's not complicated. It's literally doing one thing for one person. And if you do that one thing, you're going to feel better, and that other person's going to feel better, and then you're going to want to do it again, and they're going to want to do it. I mean, the hope is that, this is infectious. Like, we model this enough, we talk about it enough, and then we want to do it. I saw this a few days ago, just by talking about it, it inspires someone to like get up and then go buy a meal for someone. I mean, it was just like, it just that awareness. So anyway, I'm very hopeful. I believe in the power of philanthropy, and I will till the day I die. It's not a society I want to live in when we can't. So
better caught than taught. So after living through this pandemic together collectively, whether we liked it or not, this is the one virus we actually want to catch.
Nice.
So let's go out there and spread it. I don't know if I should be quoted on that, but anyway, thank you so much, Nathan Chappell,
awesome.
Ryan Crimmins. This book is available through Wiley, which is a publisher that you know. This is a book you don't have, and you also want to share it, as you were saying, with the board as well as with your colleagues, and maybe that person you meet at the bar. You just need to have that casual conversation about generosity. It's something that all of us have some experience with. We probably just need to open the door for them.
And if we could make one plug, so Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and if you're in New York, Barnes & Noble on Fifth Avenue is putting it in their store window starting tomorrow for 2 weeks. So
you can look for us on social media taking pictures of that event. So if you follow me, I'm at Gordon J. Frost on Twitter. Are you guys on these platforms very much?
I'm on Twitter, yeah.
You're on Twitter?
Yeah.
Okay.
Brian
So
Crimmins, number 9.
Number 9. Oh, wow, number 9. That's great. All these rock analogies with you. Okay, so Brian Crimmins, number 9, as well as Changing Our World, which I know has its account there. So take a look for all that. We're really grateful that you're here. I'm sorry I didn't involve more of the questions. If you have questions, I want to direct you to these guys. They're a wonderful resource for all of us and pushing us to take the next step in the direction we want to go, especially in kind of challenging times. I also want to encourage you to come back for the rest of the sessions in this series. We have 2 more coming up this week with Emily Marcus-Antolmi, and also a new one that you probably haven't learned about yet with Crystal Tompkins, who's head of the philanthropic division over at BNY Mellon, talking about what she has learned about the giving through upper high net worth individuals through her practice. So join us for all of that. as well as the rest of the series. And if you have questions or suggestions, and we want them, you can reach me at j@donorsearch.net or find me on Twitter. I'll look forward to hearing from you. Until next time, take care.
Awesome.
And
Thanks.
enjoy Radio City.
Yeah.
if you get here.
Yeah.